Hello, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Think Tank, which is episode 20 of season 5 of Star Trek Voyager. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review episodes of Voyager as determined by my user poll. The episode to win my latest user poll for Voyager was the 5th season episode, Think Tank. So in this episode, Voyager encounters a group of bounty hunters that are trying to destroy them, and it's becoming, the group is becoming larger and larger, and Voyager is at risk of being destroyed, and they can't seem to find a way out of the situation. And then they encounter Koros and his little group of misfits who Janeway deems a think tank, who promises a way out of the solution. However, they want Voyager has to pay a price in order for this solution, and that price being giving them a 7 of 9, which is a price Janeway is not willing to pay. So she does some investigation of her own and finds out that the bounty hunters were in fact hired by Koros and the think tank. So the whole thing was a setup. So they team up with the bounty hunters to overcome the think tank, as there's a bigger bounty on the think tank, and they're able to deceive them by having 7 of 9 join them, only to sabotage them, and Voyager is able to get away as the bounty hunters battle the think tank. So this is a good standalone episode of Voyager. If you know how I feel about the later seasons of Voyager, if you watch my videos at all, you know I'm not as big on the later seasons because they were very, very episodic. They hit that reset button hard after every episode, and I really think the premise of Voyager was screaming for some continuity. And I do believe we got more continuity in the earlier seasons than we did in the later seasons. In the later seasons, they just love that reset button. It was mainly because of the change in leadership with Rick Berman and Brenna Braga becoming the showrunners in the later seasons. But anywho, I mean, this is a good standalone episode, but it would have been better if it wasn't standalone. It would have been better if the think tank were reoccurring characters. It would have been better if this was tied into a larger story somehow. At the moment, it's like, yeah, this is a fun episode, but that's about it. Like, it doesn't really stand out in any way as sort of outstanding or blow my socks off. I do like the concept of having a bunch of bounty hunters go after Voyager. It's something that Star Trek usually doesn't touch stuff like that. And also Voyager, it actually takes advantage of the premise of Voyager, because Voyager is alone in the Delta Quadrant without the help of Starfleet, so they're more vulnerable to something like that. Say if Enterprise or something were got surrounded by bounty hunters, they could just call in another Starfleet ship or something to help them, whereas Voyager are pretty much screwed. And I do like the concept of the think tank as well, that there's a group of people who solve problems for other people at a cost. Now, I also think the episode's well structured, because the very first scene of the episode takes place on the think tank ship, and I do like that. And it also really lines out just what kind of people they are, because we see this alien who comes on board and is thanking the think tank for saving their whole world, or like I assume it's a colony world, because they have some sort of structural field that needs to maintain their world in order to keep the people alive, and it was degrading, and the think tank came up with the solution to restore the field, and so they saved their whole people. But and so they were thinking, savers, you saved our whole people, we're so grateful. But the thing is that Koros and the think tank wanted, as payment, they wanted some ore, which the these people needed to keep the replicators going. So in other words, they needed to feed the people because their harvests were no good because of their environmental issues. So they needed their replicators, and they needed that ore to run their replicators. And so the guy tried to lie to Koros and say that they didn't have the ore, but Koros, of course, used their superior technology to find that they do in fact have the ore, and was like saying, and then Koros threatened to just remove that field that they repaired, all the containment field that they repaired altogether, thus dooming the entire world. And so the people was like, oh no, of course we'll bring you ore. And they're like, oh, thank you, it's already forgotten. And he has this veneer of being very kind and friendly and soft-spoken, but there's teeth behind that. There's venom behind the think tank's motivations, and I love that opening scene is so great because it outlines it right from the start. You know what kind of people these people are, that they're not like saviors and they're not like champions of moral good, just people going around helping people. They're kind of exploiting them. They see that there's a problem that they have, and so they exploit them to get the resources that they want. Damn the consequences to them. Like, people are gonna starve from not having enough food, and they don't give a fuck. They're like, well, we saved your containment field. And so that's a great way to sort of outline the issue here. Now, and then later, they show up again later on, with when the Voyagers having their problem with the bounty hunters. Now, I will say I like it less the fact that we find out that the think tank was responsible for hiring the bounty hunters in the first place, because the reason why the think tank is such an interesting concept, and this was the original concept that Brennan Braga had for this episode, was a group of people who use their intelligence and wits and knowledge to solve puzzles to get people out of tough situations. And they present this as like a tactical puzzle where these bounty hunters seem to have all Voyager's escape routes. Anything that would have let them get away, they have it covered, but there's a few that aren't covered, and Janeway is like certain that they're traps. And so the puzzle is, are they really traps? Is there one of these escape routes that they actually haven't thought of? But this all becomes moot when we learn that the think tank hired these bounty hunters in the first place, because it's not really a puzzle, because the think tank aren't going to come up with this brilliant strategic solution for Voyager. They're simply gonna unhire the bounty hunters and tell them the deal's off, which kind of makes them come off more as frauds. And I think it would be more interesting, personally, if they focused more on the problem solving aspect of it. Now, Janeway is the one who coins the phrase think tank. It's not a phrase that they use. This is because when they describe what they do, she's like, oh, like a think tank, and Chorus is like, oh, yes, I like that. Very apt. But she came up with the phrase, and when I first saw this episode, I had never heard that phrase before. I had no idea what a think tank was. And in later years, the only time I ever hear the term think tank, ever since this episode, which was 20 odd years ago, the only time I ever hear it is in regards to a conservative think tank, and it usually involves them putting out a lot of money for propaganda to that's total bullshit, to try to brainwash and dissuade people from doing the right thing. That's usually the only time I hear the term think tank. So I don't know. I'm still not very clear what a think tank is. Maybe there is a group of the think tank that actually problem solve, but it seems like it's just a bunch of conservatives putting out propaganda. Anyway, they're thinking of how they can manipulate people, which I guess does line up with this episode. Anywho, And here's the thing. In this episode, Janeway says the word think way too much. It reminds me of the episode The Thaw from season 2 of Voyager, where she says the word fear way too much. She's like, fear, 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 fear. I'm afraid. Fear, fear, fear. I'm like, we get it. The clown represents fear. You don't have to keep saying the word fear over and over again. And she does the same thing here with when they're trying to come up with the solution to beat the think tank. She's like, think, people! And at the end, when she outsmarts Kuro, she's like, oh, you'll be okay. Just give it some thought. And those aren't the only examples, but those are like two most prominent. But she keeps saying think and think. We get it. It's a think tank. In fact, you came up with the term yourself, so you're kind of cheating by using the word think over and over again, because you're just like it's like self-congratulatory. Oh, I came up with the term think tank, so I'm going to say the word think over and over and over and over again. Anyway. So it's even worse than the Thaw, because at least the clown was fear, and he used the term fear, where here, they didn't even use the word think. That's something that Janeway herself came up with. But anyway. So another thing worth noting is that when Koros is listing his list of accomplishments to Janeway, he just casually mentions that he the think tank, has cured the Vidian phage. And Janeway does take a note of this, and it's like, the Vidians, like, oh wow, because of course, the Vidians were a main alien in season 1 and 2, with several appearances in seasons 3, but really that's, they moved away from their space in season 3 and hasn't really seen them since, and they will only appear in flashback form going forward, so we never actually see them past this stage. But this is canon. Like, this is lore that the Vidian phage has been cured. Which is like a huge, huge deal. Like, their whole culture was like centered around having this terrible disease that they can't cure. So if the Vidians ever appeared again in any future iterations of Star Trek, then in order to be consistent, they would have to show that their phage is cured. Now, I don't know if they ever will appear. I mean, we have Prodigy was taking place in the Delta Quadrant, but Prodigy is kind of playing very fast and loose with canon. So I don't know if they will ever appear, but that's just something to think about. That it's fascinating that they just throw it out there, and just a casual line of dialogue, this like huge, gigantic change in the Vidians. Like, that changes everything about them, but they're no longer in the show, so who cares? Let's talk about Jason Alexander. I'm surprised I waited this long to talk about him. I can't think of this episode without thinking of Jason Alexander. And in fact, it's kind of my view or opinion of this episode has always been colored or tainted by the fact that this is Jason Alexander who's playing Koros, because I don't see an alien character named Koros. I see Jason Alexander. Now, to be clear, I don't see George Costanza, because Jason Alexander plays Costanza completely different than Koros. There are totally different characters. Now, if you don't know who Jason Alexander is, he plays George Costanza on Seinfeld, and I'm a huge Seinfeld fan, especially when this episode came out, because I believe this episode came out shortly after Seinfeld ended. The final episode sucked, but other than that, the final season was actually still really good. So it ended kind of on a high note, even though it had a terrible final episode. But then again, so did Voyager, but that's another topic. Yeah, so I was a huge fan of Seinfeld and Jason Alexander. I think pretty much the only thing I'd seen him in before this episode, but Yeah, so I don't see George Costanza because George Costanza is absolutely almost the opposite of Koros, absolutely nothing like him. But I see the actor who plays George Costanza. Like I was like, hey, that's the actor who plays George, and that's. And whenever I think of this episode, I think of, hey, it's the episode Jason Alexander is in. But that's not his fault. It's like there's some names, or at least for me, that are like so recognized that you never see different characters. You always see that. Like Tom Cruise, for example, when I never see different characters, I just see Tom Cruise. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, like I don't, if he's like playing Detective Tom, Tom something I can't come up with. Tom Hammer, let's say. He's playing Detective Tom Hammer who has issues with his children or whatever, and I was like, no, I don't see that. I don't see a detective named Tom Hammer. I see Arnold fucking Schwarzenegger. Like, there's certain things that you just see that, and I kind of this way here. Even though he's not as well known of an actor, I just know, being a huge Seinfeld fan, like, is that kind of color. And I had to actually think. I tried to actually try to think real hard what my actual opinion is on this episode, because it's kind of colored by the fact that I love seeing Jason Alexander in Star Trek and in this role. So I have to try to put that aside and be like, do I actually still like this episode? And the answer is yes. Yes, I do. Now, speaking of Jason Alexander, apparently he's a huge Star Trek fan. He did a couple of like shows, interviews, hosted or guest hosts on some Star Trek celebration shows, and it was very vocal about being a Star Trek fan. They actually did a bit in one of the episodes of Seinfeld where we're talking about the Wrath of Khan and Search for Spock, where Kramer was saying the Search for Spock was clearly the better movie. And I think it was either George or Jerry was saying that the Wrath of Khan was the better movie, and at one point George even went, Khan! Like that. Anyway, so and also there was something in a lot of the trivia I was looking up on this episode mentioned that there was an episode where George was talking about naming his son Seven after the number of Mickey Mantle's jersey, and everyone thought that was a terrible name, but then again, there's a character on this show named Seven. But anyway, so Jason Alexander wanted to do Star Trek, and Star Trek wanted to have him because he was a well-known actor. So apparently, I just watched an interview with him where he was saying that throughout all of the newer, Star Trek spin-offs, I don't know if that includes Next Generation, but it could be, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, that they tried to get him on, but every time they asked him to be human, and he specifically said he did not want to play a human, he wanted to be an alien, so he turned him down. And the way he describes it, when they finally came back to him with this episode, they said, how would you like to be the smartest man in the galaxy? And then he said, now you're talking. Which I don't know if I describe Koros as the smartest man in the galaxy, because he was in the end outwitted by Janeway, but he is rather intelligent. And the role is a huge departure again, I don't know much of his work other than Seinfeld, but it's definitely a huge departure from the role that he's most known for, the role he played for like 9 years. And I think shows off his acting chops, that he's not just a funny short, stubby guy on Seinfeld who says crazy, he's very neurotic, that he actually has acting chops, because I think he does a great job as the villain here in the way he I buy him as a mastermind. Which is why I say he's almost the opposite of George Costanza. And apparently I read some things that apparently there was an outtake where Jason Alexander said the wrong line or something, and you know they messed up, and he started yelling, "Jerry, Jerry!" Yeah. Anyway, I think he does. Yeah. So I think he is definitely a highlight of this episode, and his acting does elevate it. That had they cast a lesser actor in this role, this episode probably would not work as well. It would probably fall apart. So, I mean, not much else to say about this episode. It's just, it's a pretty, as I said, it's a pretty standard episode. The Voyager finds himself in this conundrum. They find this think tank, unique aliens. It is a bit unique. It does stand out a bit from, especially from season 5 of Voyager, which if you saw my review of season 5 of Voyager, I think it's rather bland, and I think that the writers kind of started taking the characters off in different directions that weren't consistent with the rest of the show, which this episode doesn't do. This episode's pretty straightforward, pretty consistent with Janeway and 7 of 9. And I do kind of like how Janeway, you know, they had this theme of this game, this, like, it was definitely supposed to be like a Rubik's Cube type puzzle game, and no one could figure it out, and it was like really, really difficult. And 709 is like, oh, I know the solution. Janeway is like, no, don't tell me, I want to figure this out. And eventually, when they're trying to come up with the way to defeat the think tank, they're messing around with the games. And it's like, fine, I give up, 7. Show me how to do it. And so she just goes straight to it and solves it instantly. And everyone's like, how the hell did you do that? And she's like, oh, I scanned the device. And, you know, and Tom Paris is like, well, that's cheating. And then Janeway starts to realize, well, maybe that's what we need to do in order to defeat the think tank. We need to cheat. We can't outsmart them. They thought of everything. Which I'm not sure if that is actually true, because the think tank isn't even aware that Voyager knows that they're the ones who hired the bounty hunters at this stage. But I guess, so how would they plan for Voyager, like, attacking or going after the think tank directly? Because at this stage they don't think that Voyager knows about it. But I don't know, whatever. Apparently the think tank has thought of all scenarios, so the only way is to cheat. Which, I mean, they sent 7 of 9 on board. I don't see it. And she says that she's going to join the think tank, but as soon as the artificial intelligence links with her, she disconnects their translating communication, because every member of the think tank is, you know, doesn't speak the same language, and so they communicate telepathically. So she disrupts that telepathic connection. I don't really see that. How's that different than coming up with any other scenario? Like, how's that more cheating than any other scenario they could come up with to defeat the think tank? I suppose it's because they're deceiving them and saying that they surrender when they're not actually surrendering. But I don't know. Felt like a stretch for that analogy with the Rubik's Cube shit. But whatever. It was, yeah, as I said, it was still an interesting episode. So my rating for Think Tank out of 10 is going to be an 8. Extremely good. I think in the past I've given this one a 7. I think it's better than a 7. I think it is pretty unique. I love Jason Alexander's performance. I think the concept of the think tank is interesting, even though, as I said, it could have been used better. Like, I would have liked more emphasis on the puzzle solving rather than them simply deceiving them and hiring the bounty hunters in the first place. And the concept of the bounty hunters, again, was also interesting. It was an interesting scenario to have, that Voyager was being hunted by these relentless bounty hunters with a strong work ethic, as they say, with a code, so that once they take a contract, they never back down from it. And And yeah, it was the whole concept of the think tank and Voyager, Janeway having to outwit them, was interesting, but it's not, as I said, it's not great. It doesn't stand out as outstanding. I wouldn't call this as one of the best episodes of the show, but definitely one of the best of season 5. I mean, it was good. So, anyway, that is it for my review of Think Tank. Thanks so much for watching. I shall be back to review many more episodes of Star Trek, as well as covering other shows, specifically Star Trek Strange New Worlds, and other shows like Star Wars Rebels, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.